deployment of technologies in order to do things like minimize cheating, maximize student engagement, promote focus, allow instructors to receive real-time feedback from students, to build better multiple choice questions using artificial intelligence. And just generally, there's been a lot of talk about the ways in which digital technology can, quote unquote, revolutionize teaching during the coronavirus pandemic. But through observation, anecdotal evidence, and critical analysis, I, as well as I assume many of you, know that such claims are not so easily realized, right? Really, it's super important to understand context, right? So we have the context of the public health pandemic, but we also have, during this shift to online and hybrid education, which was undoubtedly a good thing in the context of the global public health pandemic, but there are a number of other variables which are influencing instructional and student experience, right? You have issues regarding broadband connectivity or even broadband access. There are financial resources, financial constraints that are creating very real impediments for students as well as instructors. Of course, there are issues of physical health as well as mental well-being that need to be taken into consideration. And generally, there's a pedagogical unpreparedness for making a shift mid-semester, but also making a shift to this different type of instructional environment. So therein lies the problem, right? Digital tech is increasingly common in contemporary higher ed, but there's not enough attention given to pedagogy with respect to digital technology. So this is my my solution, right? Or one voice amongst others for this type of solution to understanding pedagogical decisions with respect to digital tech. So rather than conceding to the inevitability of digital technology in contemporary higher ed, I'm suggesting that it's important to acknowledge the complexities of circumstances and then ultimately ask ourselves why, how, and what are the consequences of making such pedagogical decisions with regard to digital technology. And ultimately, my argument boils down to this idea that attributes of contemplation can facilitate critical engagement with our technopedagogy and lead to purposeful utilization of digital tech in higher ed, thereby leveraging the amplification possibility of digital technology and minimizing any possibility of amputation via digital technology in these teaching learning environments. And this framework, which we're going to talk about in greater depth here, I think is a very valuable tool for facilitating the integration of contemplation into technopedagogical practice within the various different ecosystems that we find ourselves working in contemporary higher education. So, acknowledging the complex interrelations amongst digital technology and pedagogy, this framework holds promise for both instructors as well as students, right? And I see both groups as being able to utilize this framework to foster more of a transformative educational environment. It's by no means a prescriptive approach to higher education. It's not a step 1, 2, 3, and your pedagogy is sorted and your students will be thoroughly engaged and creative, and you will be fulfilled as an educator, but rather it's a normative vision about how we can guide pedagogical engagement with digital technology. So ultimately, we're rethinking the purpose and practice of digital tech in higher ed by calling into question the sociocultural conceptions around education, learning, what is knowledge, what is teaching, who should be engaged in teaching, and ultimately, what is pedagogy and how do we cultivate pedagogy, right? And the purpose of today's talk is to try to look at the framework in terms of teaching sustainable food systems and sustainable food systems related endeavors. But again, this is a conversation that can exist beyond sustainable food systems and certainly beyond the coronavirus pandemic. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time explaining how this framework developed, the research methodologies behind it, and then we'll start to talk about application thereafter. And I've been tossing around some terms which are quite critical to understanding the research and the argument. So I want to spend just a moment glossing these three terms, and we can certainly we can dive into the theoretical foundations and further explicate these terms later. But for now, just to make our conversation as fruitful as possible, I want to try to develop a shared understanding of the three terms. So when I use the phrase digital technology, I'm referring to the wide array of electronic, data-oriented, tangible and intangible objects and networks. So you saw on one of the earlier slides, the desktop computer, the laptop, the internet, video conferencing, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all versions of digital technology, right? So big category. Technopedagogy. It's very critical, obviously, to understanding the Contemplative Technopedagogy Framework, but pedagogy, you can understand as theories of education within the practices of teaching, and specifically technopedagogy looks at pedagogical decisions in the presence of digital technology. So it combines the digital tech with the pedagogical in essence. And then contemplation, we know from a lot of engaging research, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment, that contemplation is in essence the practice of thinking well. And it has some inroads into pedagogy, and we'll explore those in a moment. But for our base level understanding, we can consider contemplation as the practice of being attentive to a topic by thinking thoroughly through it. And there are loads of contemplative practices, and they're very diverse. They come from a lot of traditions, and they are presented in a lot of different ways, but they include things such as mindfulness exercises, self-reflection, intense concentration or focus, things along those lines. So again, that just gives us a general shared understanding of some of the key foundational terms. And considering that many of you do work in the wonderful world of sustainable food systems, I feel rather safe in saying that you are at least familiar, if not very comfortable, bringing together often disparate disciplines in order to sufficiently understand and properly answer complex questions. And that's essentially what happened in the development of the Contemplative Technopedagogy Framework. So in order to reshape practices of teaching with digital technology, it requires a complex array of disciplines and the interplay thereof in order to understand it. So my research draws upon these three often disparate, but in this case, interconnected areas of technopedagogy, which we just discussed in brief, contemplation, which we just introduced in brief, and then science and technology studies, which in and of itself is an interdisciplinary field, which takes a historical, sociological, and philosophical approach to understanding the interrelation of science, technology, and society. So I present that as just, again, further context for where this framework comes from. And the research is really historically grounded, but it's also very practice-oriented. And it looks at how particular technopedagogical cultures develop within particular contexts in higher education. As demonstrated by Janice Newsom, who was an educational scholar who wrote quite prolifically about technopedagogy in the late 90s, she emphasizes efforts to technologize higher education resulted in a subordination of faculty roles. And really, Newsom's primacy in the critical understanding of technopedagogy is really critically important for understanding how that mindset has perpetuated then in the last 2+ decades, right? And as we see from other theorists and philosophers of media, digital technology, and educational theory, the changes that are brought about by the introduction of digital technology into higher education are on par with rather significant and wide-ranging impacts, such as a transition from oral to print culture, right? So the transition from pre-digital to digital technology is significant, is the takeaway there. And we have various individuals who are speaking and writing about the pros, cons of technology and how it integrates into pedagogical approaches. Paulo Freire, Brazilian educational philosopher and social theorist, he was cautiously positive about the emerging technologies or emerging medias and digital technologies of his era, so long as, and this is a big proviso, right, that those technologies facilitated liberation and did not perpetuate domination. And Freire saw the use of an education about these media and technologies as tools for empowering and emancipating citizens, but as you can see on the screen there, right, it's not the technology itself, which is inherently positive or negative, but it's how those technologies are applied, right? And Gardner Campbell, who is a more contemporary educational technology scholar, he echoes the great Doug Engelbart, who was a critical individual in the development of the personal computer. And he prompts this consideration of digital technology as this concept of augmenting human intellect, right? This idea that the introduction of digital technology into a teaching learning environment can make us better, faster, smarter, more capable instructors as well as students, right? And this idea that these technologies permit these high-speed calculations, and they take our cognitive processes and they put them, they imbue computers and tablets and smartphones with these capabilities. We need to ultimately investigate how these technologies are thought of as augmenting components of higher education, right? And once we start to understand that there's this strong sense of augmentation, then we can also start to understand what are the assumptions regarding pedagogical practice that are associated there. So due in large part to the emphasis on digital technology as both an emancipatory as well as a potentially liberating aspect, with the big proviso that these technologies can be used for more nefarious, less altruistic endeavors, I made the move into understanding the integration of contemplation and pedagogy, right? And we have seen terms such as contemplative, thoughtful, mindful, critical in pedagogical literature throughout the late 20th century, right? And these terms are often used interchangeably, and they all denote some sense of the significance regarding critical thinking of the whys and hows of pedagogy. However, there's very little research which integrates contemplation, pedagogy, and technology, right? Or contemplation and technopedagogy. So what we see here is a very quick historical review of the three waves of contemplative educational practices. And these are predominantly geared toward Western Europe and the United States. But as you can see, there is a long history of contemplation in education in the West. Patricia Fay Morgan was very critical in establishing this historical trajectory. But as you can see, we're really running from the late 19th century when we see the migration of immigrants from China into the Western United States, largely to work on railroad expansion in the Western United States. And along with those individuals came various practices, religious conceptions, so on and so forth. Fast forward 100 years, then we start to see the establishment of educational centers as well as universities that are focused on contemplative approaches to education. And then in the mid-90s, we see the establishment of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And it's really there where we start to see the codification of research surrounding contemplation and pedagogy. And Morgan further explicates these five influences that shape contemplative practice. And as you can see, there are a variety of religious practices, cognitive and neuroscience understandings of the way that the mind works and the way contemplation integrates into that. But I do want to emphasize that if you are not a Buddhist, not a Hindu, if you are not someone who is a neuroscientist, if you do not practice yoga, so on and so forth, that does not mean that this is an approach that is unavailable to you. This is by way of understanding the very important foundations for contemplation and its integration to pedagogy. But the Contemplative Technopedagogy Framework and my research makes a very purposeful decision not to align itself with one tradition over another or to prescribe a specific set of practices rather than others. And I made that decision in order to present contemplation as an inclusive and approachable manner to our pedagogy. And in doing so, the research and the framework explores the possibilities for uniting contemplation and technopedagogy. And it also provides a framework for purposeful and engaged thinking about digital technology and contemporary higher ed. So there are very important foundations to these understandings, but you do not need to be an expert in those foundations in order to utilize this contemplative approach to technopedagogical decisions. So one space where this conversation about pedagogy and technology occurs is within the Chronicle of Higher Education. And during the past number of decades, the Chronicle has really, it's excitedly introduced new technologies, it's skeptically bemoaned changing technologies and ideologies, and shared a lot of various best practices. I relied upon the Chronicle of Higher Education as this very large, voluminous, diverse area of discourse to try to understand how has the conception of digital technology and higher ed pedagogy changed over this period of time, right? And then secondly, in order to develop the framework, I asked within the discourse analysis, to what extent do these articles and authors address any attributes of contemplation with regard to their technopedagogy? So not to do a deep dive into the methods, I do think it's important to look at the scale and the scope of the research. So as I mentioned, it was a discourse analysis project. It involved roughly 8,500 articles from the initial keyword search, which then got whittled down ultimately through title and abstract review, full text review, and then ultimately a random selection of 10% of articles per year to get to a final N of 137 articles, which were involved in the entirety of the full text discourse analysis. So there's a very large, voluminous body of literature that can be investigated. For the purposes of developing the framework, it was from this N of 137. And what we see ultimately through the keyword search, the initial keyword search, which resulted in the nearly 8,500 manuscripts, involved a variety of terminology commonly used within discourse about technology in higher education, as well as pedagogy in higher education. And ultimately, I settled on this combined keyword search of teaching and technology, digital and technology, and pedagogy and technology, to get the most representative sample in order to answer the research questions from the Chronicle of Higher Education database. And as you can see, the teaching and technology search string is undoubtedly most appropriate. It captures what's going on in those other two search strings, and it gives, or it results in the least duplicative body of literature. So from that discourse analysis of 137 articles from 78 unique authors, what I ended up doing was developing two themes for analysis. Theme number one looks at conceptions of technology and pedagogy. And theme number two looks at those attributes of contemplation with respect to pedagogy and technology. And overwhelmingly, as you can see, in the first conception, authors had an overwhelmingly positive conception of digital technology for teaching. So many of these positive portrayals really strongly champion the ways in which digital tech was certain, and I think that's a key word to emphasize, certain to improve instruction, right? This idea that through the simple introduction of a digital technology into your teaching practice, it will make you a, quote, better instructor and make students better students, right? And then we see nearly equal categories for digital technology portrayed as negative and digital technology portrayed as both positive and negative. And then a smaller group coded as neutral, where there was no value judgment. It was more just an introduction of what's going on. And so this research ultimately argues that because there is such an overwhelming voice for the positive attributes of digital technology, there is space for us to be more critically aware, more self-reflexive, more contemplative ultimately regarding digital technologies. And that's where the second theme of attributes of contemplation really developed from. So it's important to note, so what you see on the screen here is this is the N for those articles that addressed some attribute of contemplation. And it wasn't always introduced as iterative design. It wasn't introduced as pedagogy-focused faculty development. That is terminology that I developed from elsewhere in the literature. So what we can see here are the 9 sub-themes for the attributes of contemplation attributing for 49 articles. So overwhelmingly, 88 of the 137 articles were coded as not involving any aspect of contemplation at all. And it's important to note that because it's the overwhelming majority, it's about 64% of the articles that were investigated. But this really demonstrates the absence of that critical thought, of that contemplative approach to making decisions about the introduction of digital technology into a teaching learning space. So, and we're going to go through this in more depth in a moment, but I want to show from the discourse analysis and the two areas of thematic understanding that ultimately led to the inductive development of the contemplative technopedagogy framework. So what you have here is one hub at the center, which emphasizes the importance of taking both a positive and negative approach to of technology. So understanding that it's certainly not all sunshine and rainbows, but it's also not all doom and gloom. That we need to understand that these positives and negatives exist simultaneously in a both and scenario. Right, so that encourages us to be reluctant to make these knee-jerk either dismissals or these uninformed embraces of digital technology. Right, so starting from the hub on this both and understanding of digital technology really allows us then to move around the ring, which involves 9 attributes of contemplative technopedagogy, as well as 5 areas of focus. And what I like to do for the remainder of my time today is to walk through these different areas of context and try to understand, or try to communicate rather, how a contemplative approach to technopedagogical decisions can ultimately benefit our teaching and learning both now as well as after the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, I want to emphasize that this is by no means prescriptive. It's a normative vision to guide our pedagogical engagement with technology, right? And additionally, the framework is purposely designed as a circle, right? There's no beginning, there's no end. You can move in and out of the framework to suit your needs. And additionally, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's absolutely no need to have a background in mindfulness, no need to have advanced knowledge about digital technology. It's not even necessary that you have previous pedagogical training. Right, the framework is designed to be approachable, and it's designed to be very tailorable to suit the diverse needs, interests, and contexts in which we all operate. And I also recognize that many of you, if not most of you, already engage in some type of contemplative practices for pedagogical and/or other purposes. You may not call it contemplative, but this approach of thinking thoughtfully and deeply and critically about things is great. That's fantastic pedagogical practice. And I suspect that you can find space for those types of practices within this type of framework. But again, the goal is to provide an integrative and cohesively reflective approach for making pedagogical decisions involving digital technology. So that's the space in which I present this framework. And so what I will do now is walk through how these different aspects, these different areas of focus can be applied within different pedagogical approaches. So as I have said at length, right, digital tech features prominently. It's increasing in scope and scale. There are calls for it to be even more prevalent. And educators and learners come into the higher education space with a lifetime of experiences regarding digital technology. But we need to caution ourselves about making assumptions regarding the not only the inevitability and perceived ubiquity of digital technology, but also question our assumptions about the pros and cons of the technologies, as well as the interests, the capabilities, and the experience of learners. Right. Of course, acknowledge that your teaching and your students' learning does not happen in a vacuum. There are a variety of sociocultural variables that shape the experience of what is desirable or what is not feasible. For example, as I had alluded to earlier, right, during the previous few semesters, many of us were required to make a very quick transition to online or perhaps hybrid style instruction. And in many, if not all cases, that necessitated the introduction of some sort of video conferencing technology. And it's of course easy to find a video conferencing software, but it's not so easy to select an option, right? Let alone the quote unquote best option. But if we acknowledge the context as well as the technosocial dynamics, it allows us to understand that we should do some due diligence before making a decision, right? Do an environmental scan, understand the different video conferencing platforms that are out there, understand and appreciate best practices, what works, what doesn't work, what might work for you, and certainly identify the software that students are already using. However, appreciating that they may not be using that software for academic purposes. Therefore, it may be incumbent upon you as an instructor not only to teach course content, but also to spend some time teaching the technology, right? We cannot expect instructors, we cannot expect students simply to learn magically how to use a technology, let alone use a technology for academic purposes, right? So we certainly need to understand the hows and the whys that we may introduce a particular technology, such as video conferencing, into the classroom. In the pedagogy-focused area of the Contemplative Technopedagogy Framework, acknowledges that pedagogy ultimately should drive our technological decisions, not vice versa. And then also within the larger institutional context, faculty development initiatives, professional development initiatives really should try to leverage, again, the primacy of pedagogy rather than the primacy of technology. So for example, when encountering the latest and greatest technology, it's important that an instructor not get swept up by in the enthusiasm and assume that a particular technology will solve any pedagogical problems, revolutionize teaching, so on and so forth. To be sure, to be honest, technology can definitely be a tremendous asset for higher education teaching and learning. But before it's an asset, you need to ask yourself a series of interconnected questions. Why do I want to use this technology? How will I use this technology? When will I use this technology? And to what end am I integrating this technology into the teaching learning environment? And in answering those questions, you can identify any gaps that need shoring up before a technology can really holistically enrich a teaching learning environment. So it's about being self-reflexive and engaging in these processes as early and as often as possible, so you can hopefully anticipate any areas that need further development before introducing and ultimately succeeding with that technology in the teaching learning environment. So the Technopedagogy Framework works from a premise that digital tech should foster connections and not create distractions within the teaching and learning environment. And digital technology, as we have seen in various educational and non-educational contexts, has a tremendous power to connect. It has the ability to expand the average citizen's ability to express ideas, circulate those ideas amongst large and ever-growing publics. But in order to facilitate and realize those opportunities for a participatory culture within education, it's really important to recast how we may utilize these different technologies within the higher education space. So it's important to cultivate this technopedagogical mindset that encourages instructors and students to participate in the teaching learning environment in a way that it does connect us amongst each other, but to do so in practicing mindful behaviors with regard to digital technology. For example, any tech that you introduce into your teaching should definitely work for you as an instructor, right? I mean, that I hopefully should go without saying, but it's critically important, right? Any technology you want to introduce should work for you as a student. However, the technology needs to also work for the student, right? And unfortunately, all too often, technological decisions are made at an individual or institutional level without sufficient understanding of student knowledge, student experiences, and student constraints. And whenever using a technology, there are various opportunities to model mindful behavior. Sometimes this can be done explicitly with a lesson that involves some practice of mindfulness. You can potentially integrate language about mindfulness into an assignment, or you can lead an in-class guided meditation using something like Headspace, as we did earlier, or you can certainly develop your own guided meditation practices. And other times you may be more implicit or less explicit about it in ways that you're modeling through your behaviors or the way that you're integrating with your technology during class sessions or in advance of class sessions. So ultimately, we want to connect learners, and understanding that learners are both those of us who are in the educational role as well as those of us who are in more of the traditional role, and using technologies in ways that are participatory and connective rather than destructive. As we move to the bottom of the Contemplative Technopedagogy Framework and arrive in the technology-focused area of interest, we start to get into some issues of evaluation and design. So ultimately, this type of approach requests from the educator a commitment to be both learner and teacher. Digital technology is constantly evolving. There are new technologies entering, old technologies leaving, variations, user updates, so on and so forth. So as much as technology is evolving, so too should an educator's knowledge of technologies and ways that it might be applied within a teaching learning environment. And certainly appreciating that a technology may be new to use an instructor and may also likely be new to the students as well. So there is a great opportunity for instructors to help students understand, students to help instructors understand. And that develops through the communication and connecting that was emphasized in the learner-focused approach, this idea that we should be engaging in dialogue and a participatory culture where students as well as faculty feel comfortable and permitted to engage in dialogue surrounding what is or is not working. So along those lines, as you are introducing technologies and approaches, you have to remind yourself it's not about telling the students answers, but working with them to develop solutions to problems that may exist or to problems that develop, right? And so it requires educators to understand how a specific digital technology did or did not work within a particular context. After you have done your due diligence with allowing your pedagogy to drive your technological decisions, after the semester, during the semester, in preparation for an upcoming semester, ask yourself, did this technology help to accomplish my intended pedagogical goals? When and how might I use this technology differently? Did anything unexpected happen? And in asking those questions, not only of yourself as an educator, but asking those questions of students. There is all too often we are reluctant to again humanize and make ourselves vulnerable to our students and ask them for feedback about what worked, what did not work. But this commitment to building, changing, tweaking, removing, modifying, et cetera, the technologies or approach to a particular assignment in response to a self-evaluation or response to evaluation from students is really critical to realizing any technologies potential success within the higher education environment. And then our final area of focus, the attention area of focus, begins from the premise that technology can engage and enrich, but it can also distract and it can amputate, as I mentioned earlier. And this area calls for educators to focus less on the very polemic rhetorics of disruption or destruction and revolution and liberation, and really turn to matters of intentionality, right? Which question your assumptions about what is or is not possible. What do or do not students know? And certainly understanding that technology is not it's good, it's not good, it's not bad, it's certainly not neutral. It in and of itself does not carry a value. Its utilization and its deployment within higher education is really what's critically important. And as I mentioned early in the presentation, really it's about having this moment for a thoughtful pause where we can determine what is my intention with introducing this technology. Am I being present with regard to understanding what is happening within the educational environment as well as external to the educational environment for my students, and understanding the ways in which the technology, the technological artifact, facilitates or inhibits presentness or intentionality, and ways in which you can restructure the orientation of that technology to facilitate intention or some better degree of presentness. So that was a quick review of those different areas of focus, as well as some of the different attributes of contemplation presented therein. And ultimately, the discourse that led to the discourse analysis that led to the development of this contemplative technopedagogy framework really, I think, draws attention to this idea that there's so much that we have to acknowledge and address with respect to the pros and cons of technology. And we need to do those in tandem. It's not about an either or approach. It's really about this integrative both and approach. And as I often say, I certainly consider myself a critical utopian. And this research of the many utopian options, this research focuses on the practices, philosophies, and really the possibilities for realizing the best possible pedagogical paradigm for digital technology in higher ed. And there are a lot of different pedagogies, policies, technological innovations, sociocultural practices, and other nodes that have and continue to shape higher education. So we certainly need to be aware of that context when trying to utilize anything like the Contemplative Technopedagogy Framework or otherwise. But rather than just criticizing what is happening or what is insufficient or deficient, this approach really tries to move from critique to construction, right? And this idea that we can identify the flaws in the technology, we can identify the flaws in the pedagogy, but really, at the end of the day, we need to find a way that allows a contemplative approach to shift the discourse, enrich our conception, and enable action with respect to ways that do augment or enrich teaching and learning environments through digital technology. As Will said at the outset, right, this idea that these digital technologies, are online learning environments, are not likely to go away anytime soon. So rather than bemoan that context, we need to find ways that really enrich that context to realize our pedagogical intentions, as well as enables our students to be involved in creative problem solving in sustainable food systems or many other endeavors. And ultimately, I see this framework and the application thereof as a way to reshape teaching with digital tech. And I certainly hope that it can be applied within the various contexts that you find yourselves. Be that if you're teaching a guest lecture, developing a course, chairing a department, leading a university, whatever the case might be, wherever you operate within higher education, I think there are opportunities for us to integrate contemplation in piecemeal or wholesale ways, because I mean ultimately it's not about the digital technology. It's digital technology is what gets us to the thing, and the thing in this case is teaching and learning. So that went a bit longer than anticipated, so I apologize for taking a bit more of your time, but I would love to engage in some discussion, ask or address any questions that people might have. And yeah, thank you everybody for your time. If we have some time, I'd love to have some conversation in this space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanks. We are at the hour, but we generally stay about 20 minutes to 30 minutes past the hour. So for those of you who are able, please continue to stay with us. Justin, I really appreciated you sharing about the theory and history of contemplation and its integration into technopedagogy. Those are all new things for me and things that I'm continuously using. So it's really nice to have more background on that, and I really appreciated sort of you laying out how that informed the development of your framework for enriching teaching practices that other educators can adapt that are approachable. And one theme that really stood out to me, and it was something you mentioned in the beginning, but then sort of brought throughout your presentation, is the concept of humanizing practice and our teaching practice. This really, acknowledging the person. And this is a theme that has been mentioned by each of our speakers in this webinar series. And it's really wonderful to see how each speaker comes or presents a different modality and a way of humanizing practice and acknowledging the educator and the person and their values, etc., into practice. So it was really nice to see how you sort of laid that out in terms of technopedagogy and contemplation. Yeah, so it'd be wonderful to hear people's reflections on what was just presented. And I'm going to pass it on to Will to sort of break the ice and open it up for reflection. And then others can either type in the chat window or unmute your mics. So on to you, Will.
Hey, thanks, Selena. And thanks so much, Justin, for this wonderful presentation. Like, there's just so much in here, and it relates so much to what we're experiencing, what we see in our classrooms, and to the food system as well. So I've heard a number of questions, so I figure where to jump in. I guess I might start with, in your own classes, do you have any kind of like icebreaker activities? Because I imagine you teach classes on informational sciences, but you also teach classes involved in the food system. But the idea is, like, do you have any introductory activities you use that get students to reflect on technology kind of from the outset, and how you might then build upon that because I could see it leading into like developing metacognitive strategies, so they're more aware of how they're learning with what they're learning. But yeah, so do you have any intro type of activities you like to use, knowing that it can lead elsewhere within your courses?
Yeah, that's a that's a great question, Will. And I appreciate the fact that you emphasize the metacognitive aspects of it, right? And self-awareness is a big component of contemplation, right? And certainly of this framework, and also something that we ultimately strive to cultivate amongst our students. So anytime that there is an opportunity to allow a student the capacity, the capability, the space to step outside themselves and sort of see how they are or are not in charge of their own education certainly is critical. So one thing that I do of course want to answer your question directly as well as more abstractly, but one thing that I do like to do is we always in my classes spend some time doing sort of an artifactual analysis of some piece of technology. So in the class I'm teaching this semester, this term, about coffee, we're spending a lot of time getting very familiar with the technological artifact of the Hario V60 pour over and the ways in which that augments or influences the experience of preparing as well as consuming coffee. So in sustainable food-oriented classes, I would typically start with one of those artifacts that we all have. For example, this is a lab-based class, or partially a lab class, so they all were provided these pour-over apparatus. So we talk about how does this influence your experience? How does this benefit or detract from that experience? In more of an information science setting or in something that's more digital technology oriented. I don't know where, oh, there it is. So you take one of these guys out, right? And you talk about how this influences your experience of communicating either within the classroom, or you can talk about it more abstractly. So I think, using the physical technological artifact is always a good way to take something that is fuzzy and abstract, and we all sort of have a sense of what it is, but it puts it in very concrete terms, so then you can start to give the student a space to explore independently. And then of course we have usually very fruitful conversations about the pour over or about the phone, or of course in this online environment we can talk about ways in which the laptop or the tablet does or does not facilitate engagement with content. But I think just again that I do often rely upon this concept of the thoughtful pause. So be that whatever technology you're dealing with, take that thoughtful pause and just ask yourself simple questions like, well, why am I using this, or how am I using this? Should I be using it this way? And just kind of probe into that space a little bit. And if everyone does have the same artifact like the pour over, or most individuals in the college environment, higher education environment in North America have some sort of smartphone. So it's a good jumping off point, a shared jumping off point that we can usually engage in discussion about.
Thank you. It also reminded me that to maybe bring in more tools, more equipment from in the food system as a starting point, as a great way to like just start any kind of lecture, series, session, is like hold up a tool, ask students if they're familiar with it, what it might be used for, or how does it work? Even the simple thing of like a coffee machine, how does it actually work, and what did it replace?
Yeah.
And has it been replaced? Yeah, I can see. I don't usually bring in like technology, and I'll stop talking in a second. But there's also that I think in our students, technology divides them in terms of some who they think they're anti-technology in a way, like they're like, oh no, like a good food system doesn't have technology. And you're like, oh wait a second, that's a challenging issue. And then others like, no, I'm interested in the food system because of technological innovation. So it's like you've got these really interesting divides probably, as well as are increasingly like very few of us really engage with like the tools of the food system anymore because of how the corporate food system is kind of created like plug and play food. So it's this is really helping you see like how technology and tools, not just in like our digital mediums, but also within our classroom, should be augmented because they connect us in so many different ways. So thank you. I'll let other people talk.
Yeah, and just real quick as we so cue somebody else up, I think that's a really great analysis of that, Will. And then of course allowing the students the space to chase that down in the different directions I like, of course pertaining to course topics, right? But the ability to say, I'm not sure. Let's figure that out together, right? And that again, that creates this shared sense of learning and community, and acts to humanize you as the professor, and hopefully then encourages more engagement and conversation throughout the term.
Sarah, I see your hand raised. I'm going to pass it on to you.
I just want to say hi and thank you. I love this conversation. The folks on this call who know me know that this is something I love, and it was related to Will's question. So I was just curious, like, one of the things I'm trying to do is not just have the contemplative practice be an island in the class, like to really infuse the whole class. It's not just like, okay, we're going to do this breath and now we're into class, and it's just like this thing that's just like compartmentalized. And so I'm just curious, you just talked about the artifact exercise, but like what other ways you're experimenting with where you're really just like designing the whole thing to be a contemplative experience. And of course, there's questions that I think would be for another time about assessment in that too, but it's just something I'm thinking a lot about, in like how to really make it, the whole thing, be a contemplative experience. And my other question also is just what other professional networks you're a part of that are for contemplative practice. The Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Ed is one I've been a part of for many years, and I'm just curious on those two fronts.
Thank you, Sarah, for those questions. I'm gonna, in the back of my mind, try to pull up my CV while I'm responding to your first part of your question, so I don't miss anything. But yeah, I entirely agree. You certainly don't want to create this isolated island of like, okay, now it's our mindfulness time, and after we do that, we're going to go back to the frantic environment of higher education. So I think the place that I would encourage you to start from is with yourself, right? And the way that you design the course, structure the assignments, develop your lectures, seminars, labs, so on and so forth, right? So certainly you can do that from the ground, right? Start from scratch, or you can take an existing course or a model and build it and make it authentic from there. And I think that authenticity part is really important, right? Because it's so easy to, hey, I'm going to teach a course about XYZ topic, so do a quick web search, find a syllabus, and use that as our sort of model maybe that we want to build. Which there's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's great to have a model to start from, but the authentic part of instruction, the authentic part of contemplation is, I think, cannot be emphasized enough, right? You can't really teach someone else's course. You can't pretend, right? You can't act as though you're someone else and do it in a way that's enriching for you as well as enriching for your students. So I would say, figure out what works for you. What do you feel comfortable with? What do you feel knowledgeable about? And how can you take your existing practices and make them increasingly contemplative, right? And iterative design is one thing that's emphasized in this framework, and understanding that it's iterative design not only in the way that you introduce your technologies. It's not just iterative in the way that you make your assignments, but it's it's iterative in the way you design your course. But it's also iterative in the way that you give a particular seminar, or iterative in the way that you do or do not address certain things in certain ways, right? Understanding that, one class session is one class session, and then the next class session is an opportunity to be more contemplative, or to involve your students in ways that perhaps you wish you would have done in a previous session. And just recognize that, contemplation, teaching, education, et cetera, they're all practices, right? These are not things that we master potentially ever. These are things that we are constantly striving to become more proficient at. And that, I've used the, authenticity phrase and the humanizing phrase, but, vulnerability is a big part of being an educator, being an instructor, being a human, really. But this idea that, making yourself vulnerable, acting or presenting yourself in an authentic way is really critical, rather than acting or putting on a facade of this is what I think my students want, or this is what I think the institution wants from me, right? If you can find a way to be your true, authentic, vulnerable human self, I think that goes a long way to designing courses, creating assignments, giving seminars in ways that are contemplative, and invite students to participate in those practices, right? So much of it is modeling behavior that we hope to see from our students, and at the same time recognizing that we of course want to cultivate that amongst everyone that we interact with in higher education, but that unfortunately is not the reality of the scenario, right? We are not going to cultivate contemplative mindset amongst everyone to the same degree. We may reach everyone to a small degree. We may reach some to a very large degree, but there's a very large spectrum, and there are ebbs and flows. And some days we're a better educator, some days we're a better human than other days. And, it's embracing that fallibility, I think, is critically important. And then professional organizations, I'm drawing an entire blank. The Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education is one of them. But Sarah, if you drop me an email, I'd be happy to share some additional professional resources with you. And over in the chat, I'm seeing lots of great stuff about Habermas and Ivan Illich and other wonderful people. So yeah, the final slide, which I didn't show, has some additional resources in it. But Habermas is great. Tools for Conviviality is a great text as well. There's a lot of really good reading in this space. So please do check that out. But I interrupted someone.
Oh, hey, yeah, no worries. Just like a couple of questions, like one, it just like strikes me as familiar to some of the like Mennonite background I have, in that like our contemplative practice is largely like simple living decisions around how to interface with technology and questions like that. So it makes a lot of sense to me in terms of like thinking about like more is not better, and how do we interface, and what's going to actually be, productive. And that was just one thought. And then another question I had was like whether you're seeing contemplative practice as directly related to thought, or like the thought that is related to learning. Like, is contemplative practice in your mind like very close to or related to the type of thought students need to learn, or is it preparatory for it? Thanks.
Yeah, those are great observations, great comments. And your mention of Mennonite practice is one of many schools of thought with respect to contemplation. I mean, really, if we trace this thread of contemplation with respect to higher education or to education, we go back ancient Greece, right? And we see notions of contemplation really guiding inquiry, where it becomes popularized and integrated into U.S. education or North American education is from the Chinese, Japanese schools of thought traditionally. But yeah, Mennonite practice, ancient philosophical practices, we see it in a variety of different schools of thought. And that's, again, one of those reasons that it's not the Buddhist contemplative technopedagogy framework or the Hindu contemplative technopedagogy framework, because I think there are different lessons that we can pull on from these different schools of thought, and of course understanding the context in which we are operating as individuals or institutionally to make sure that we can gain traction and again find our authentic selves in that. And Dan, I love your question about is contemplation a component of learning or a precursor to learning? And I think I would say it's both. So I think this contemplative approach to thought, right, is certainly a precursor to engaging in further contemplative inquiry regarding a disciplinary domain or complex problem solving or whatever the case might be, right? It's this importance of critical analysis, depth of inquiry, self-reflection, right? Those are all tenets of contemplation, but they're all also tenets of complex problem solving or enriching education and so forth. So yeah, I'd say both precursor and component of, certainly both.
Right on, thank you.
Yeah. So it seems maybe we've hit a lull in questions, which is fine. But I do encourage everybody. I think the slides, or at least the recording, will be posted, and the very end of that there are some resources. But please do reach out to me if you have questions about the framework, about contemplation, about the application. If you're looking for professional networks, if you're looking for additional resources, whatever the case might be. This is the middle or early middle part of a hopefully a very long conversation. So I do encourage everybody to reach out if you need anything.
I do have another question. If no one else, go ahead, Selena.
Oh, go ahead, Will.
Well, I was just, it's kind of floating around my mind, and I'm hoping something clear will come out of this question. But it's almost that, so Justin, from your perspective, further down this road of, like, I suspect you have a very fine-tuned radar for how folks conceptualize, talk about technology in the classroom. And I'm wondering, for you, when you're engaging with other faculty members or instructors or students, what are some of the like the red flags that go off when you have conversations? Or red flags would be like, oh, I think we're drifting into an area that needs a bit of maybe intervention. Or if you want to flip it to an asset size, what are some of the conversations you've had that demonstrate what you would consider more responsible ways of engaging with technology? Like when you have those one-on-one conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question, Will. So, I would say generally something that is, a red flag or, a warning sign, or like, oh, we gotta maybe unpack that statement a little bit, is when it's a very clear, like, yes, this is fantastic, or, oh my goodness, I want nothing to do with this. And you mentioned some examples yourself of, why students may or may not get interested in studying food systems, right? And it's either the technological innovation side, and so on one end of the spectrum, or the I don't want any technology involved, which if you unpack that very quickly, right, there's some technology involved in our understanding of, agriculture itself as a technology, right? So I think anytime there's a very polarizing statement, that's certainly something that needs to be unpacked and really contextualized and critically analyzed. And often encounter those sorts of scenarios in classroom settings, right, where a student will say something, and that's one of those opportunities. We often hear the phrase teachable moment, right? So that's an opportunity, again, to create a conversation, a community conversation around, okay, well, why do you think this, or why do we have this assumption? Why does this operate so commonly within this context, right? And engage in that sort of a dialogue. But when having conversations with colleagues or peers or others, right, it's again those polarizing comments certainly would be an opportunity to have a little bit of conversation about those topics. But also there's so much cultural or institutional momentum around particular technologies or particular technological infrastructures where, oh well, this is the learning management system that we use, so of course I'm going to use it, or I'm going to complain about it incessantly because I was not, consulted on whether or not that should be the learning management system that the university purchases. So those types of mindsets I think are very prevalent. Either, again, they tend to be very polarizing, but assuming that simply because something is the way that it is does not mean that that is the way that it should be, right? So I think those are, I find, very fruitful conversations of, someone bemoans a particular LMS, or they bemoan a, institutionally provided XYZ software, right? It's a great opportunity to talk about, okay, well, what do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What do you hope to accomplish pedagogically, rather than just, okay, well, don't use that technology, use this technology, right? Because it's not really a decision amongst technologies. It's a decision amongst pedagogical approaches to different technologies. So engaging in sort of the step back, right, or the thoughtful pause about, well, is it really the technology, or is it an understanding of, or application of, right? And which is not to say it's the technology's problem, it's not the instructor's problem, but it's it's having this contextual understanding of, there's a lot of other stuff going on that led to the development of this technology, which has influenced why it has this feature, that feature, why the university purchased it, why your students don't like it, why you don't, there's all these other things going on. So it's really about problematizing and then finding a thread that you can sort of tease out to identify, you know, the how, the when, the to what extent, and how do I need to tweak it next time, type of approach.
Thanks. That's good. It's good to keep in mind these types of kind of the landmines or the red flags or the opportunities to dive a bit deeper. It reminds me a bit of, and I like how you brought this up too, to really realize that we are in a moment of intense change, like similar to the printing press. My father-in-law in the 80s, he was a high school math teacher, and I think he did his master's thesis on, the question was, will calculators in the classroom, like, should we allow calculators in the classroom? Will it ruin math? And I remember the first time I heard that, I thought that was your thesis. Like, I didn't realize I couldn't put myself in that context. And I think I'm better at that now, but it's realizing how technology does have these enormous, and then we take for granted the thresholds that we've crossed. And part of, I guess, the contemplative practice is these opportunities to remind ourselves really how significant technology does impact us, and how to again help humans. For me, it helped me understand better my naivety and my inability to understand context. But that piece, I think technological change, because it becomes so it just becomes part of the air we breathe, that we really miss out on these learning opportunities. So thanks. I could talk. I think we could talk about this for a long time. So I appreciate having this much airspace, and I'll pass it over to Selena. But yeah, thanks again, Justin, so much for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Will.
My comment, and you sort of touched upon this, was sort of thinking about what is technology. So when we're thinking about the food system, and they're sort of like anti-technologists, but as you were saying, Justin, agriculture is technology, and thinking about sort of almost, you know, in indigenous communities, there's all of these indigenous technologies. They are technology. So I think that conversation, you know, of what is technology, and at what point, you know, does technology, I think it's like, is it the modernism of it, or like the intensity of it? At what point does it sort of go from, you know, a technology that people sort of don't see necessarily as technology, to one that might be invasive or intensive? So I think, you know, like, what is that threshold or that continuum? I think that's just a really fascinating question, because, you know, like, agriculture is a over 10,000-year-old technology. With all of these technologies, indigenous communities continue to have these technologies, but we don't see them as technology. So yeah, just lots to think about, and thinking about like, what is technology in the food system?
Yeah, and you know, there's again a ton to unpack there, but I think your comment, Selena, and Will's comment really connect nicely. You know, is the calculator example, or you know, agricultural technology has this 10,000-year-old history with all sorts of different you know, micro histories within it. But you know, we have these moments, these inflection points, or these paradigm shifts, as Thomas Kuhn calls them, right, where all of a sudden, once XYZ occurs, and obviously it doesn't happen overnight, right? There's a big build up to it, but then all of a sudden there is this inflection point, or this paradigm shift, or all of a sudden after that, our paradigm is incommensurable with what came before, right? So all of a sudden we think, well, yeah, a calculator, like, that's clearly not going to change math. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're antiquated now. I have a calculator on my phone. Why do I need it, right? So it's this incommensurability with the previous paradigm or previous paradigms, right? That it's very hard to understand from this perspective. So often now, when we talk about technology, we're referring to digital technology, right? We're referring to artificial intelligence, computational systems, so on and so forth, right? And it's very hard to step outside of that paradigm, outside of that understanding as an educator or as a student, and say, oh, well, I'm anti-technology for agriculture, and understand that the point that we're at now in agriculture, and you may not be, you know, please send artificially intelligent tractors out into the fields. I mean, that might be what that individual is talking about, but of course they need to understand the deep, complex history of technology involved in getting us to this point, right? And there's issues of technological momentum, where certain infrastructures or types of technologies get instantiated and survive longer than others, but there's always various different options to choose amongst. And it's through this process of stabilization and solidification where particular types of technologies become the predominant technology at a particular time, in a particular cultural context, associated with particular users, right? So, you know, we have the calculator example. We have all sorts of variations amongst agricultural technology, from its very early origins in the Middle East through all of the different places where agriculture has been practiced. There are all sorts of, you know, technological practices around the world with respect to food production, food processing, food distribution, so on and so forth. So again, these are really fruitful opportunities to engage in very eye-opening, community-building conversations. And, you know, of course, there are people who, you know, their entire area of focus is agricultural technology from a historical perspective or computational perspective, but you need not be an expert in order to introduce those ideas you know, to students, and really, I think, do so in a way that is contemplative, as Dan mentioned, right? And this precursor to developing this further contemplative inquiry with respect to the content knowledge that their degree program or discipline would encourage.
So much to think about. Well, thank you so much, Justin, for that. And thank you to all of our participants. Just a reminder that our final webinar of the year will be on December 1st. David Meek will be speaking about his new book on the political ecology of education. So we hope you can all join us. And this webinar was recorded. I missed the first 10 minutes of recording. So I apologize for that. And but it will be recorded and posted because I think that you can, this is a webinar that you can go back and listen to lots of good things in there. So thank you all so much. And thank you so much, Justin.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was great to chat with all of you. And yeah, please reach out if you have questions or comments.
Well, thank you, Rhoda. It was nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
Yeah,
Thanks,
well.
Lena.
All right.